The central issue dominating national security discussions right now is the War Powers Act, specifically, whether it is being respected or dangerously ignored. The President of the United States has unilaterally deployed an enormous military force to the Caribbean without formally seeking authorization from Congress. This rapid expansion includes Air Force B-1 and B-52 strategic bombers, an attack submarine, a full carrier strike group, a Marine amphibious unit, and significant U.S. Army Special Operations personnel. Taken together, this is not a limited mission. It is, on its face, a force posture capable of conducting a full-scale invasion or the rapid destruction of the Venezuelan armed forces. Retired General Barry McCaffrey has clearly stated that the justification being offered by the administration, that two suspected individuals in a small boat posed an ongoing threat to the United States, is simply not credible. According to him, the claim is nonsense, and the idea that such minor actors represent a danger worthy of repeated lethal strikes does not withstand basic scrutiny. He also notes that the inquiry into the legality of the strikes has effectively been closed by those in charge. The admiral overseeing the operation asserted that the individuals could have flipped the boat, framing them as a continued threat. McCaffrey, however, calls this argument equally nonsensical. He points out a long-standing rule of intelligence analysis: assess an enemy by their capabilities, not their stated intentions. And based on observable U.S. military capabilities now positioned in the Caribbean, this looks far less like anti-drug activity and far more like preparations for high-intensity combat operations that could remove the Maduro government entirely. McCaffrey further explains that if this operation were genuinely about counter-narcotics, the United States would not be focusing on Venezuela. Cocaine production overwhelmingly takes place in Colombia, not Venezuela, and has tripled in the last decade largely due to the absence of aerial eradication programs. Venezuela functions primarily as a transit country, not a producer. So if the justification doesn't align with reality, what is the real objective? McCaffrey suggests the true motivation is oil, a desire by powerful interests surrounding the administration to open Venezuela's vast natural reserves to American and international oil companies. He names giants such as Shell, ExxonMobil, and BP as beneficiaries of such regime change ambitions. This, he argues, is not about a global drug crisis. It is about economic power and geopolitical influence. His concerns are echoed by independent journalist Siri Crow from the Midas Touch Network, who emphasizes the contradictions in the administration's narrative. She highlights that if the president was serious about fighting narcotics, he would not have recently pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of enabling massive drug trafficking operations. Trump's own Department of Justice stated that Hernandez helped turn Honduras into one of the most dangerous drug-scented nations in the world. Yet he received a presidential pardon after serving less than a year of his sentence. This, Crow argues, undermines any claim that the administration's military operations in the Caribbean are about combating illegal drugs. Even more troubling is the conduct of the military strikes themselves. Reporting indicates that U.S. forces repeatedly targeted a small Venezuelan boat, and while some individuals were killed in the initial strike, 2 survivors remained alive, clinging to debris from their destroyed vessel. According to congressional members who viewed the full, unreleased video footage, these 2 men were clearly incapacitated, unarmed, and posed no possible threat. They had no weapons, no radio equipment, and no means of coordinated communication. They appeared to be signaling for help. Despite this, U.S. forces executed additional strikes, resulting in the death of the 2 shipwrecked survivors. Multiple lawmakers who view the footage, including Congressman Adam Smith and Congressman Jim Himes, have stated that the strikes against these incapacitated individuals raise profound legal, ethical, and moral questions. Under the laws of armed conflict, once an individual is unable to participate in hostilities, they are considered out of combat and cannot be legally targeted. These principles exist not only to preserve humanitarian norms but also to protect American service members who might one day find themselves in a similar situation. The administration's justification, that the survivors could be picked up by their allies and somehow re-enter the fight, has been widely dismissed as improbable and unsupported by evidence. Lawmakers confirmed that the stranded men had no communication devices and were physically incapable of mounting any resistance. They were simply clinging to debris in open water. This has intensified concerns that the administration is conducting unauthorized wartime actions and stretching the president's authority under the War Powers Act far beyond its legal boundaries. Many national security experts argue that Congress must reassert its constitutional role, because allowing a president to unilaterally carry out lethal military operations against individuals hundreds of miles away, based on hypothetical future threats, sets a perilous precedent. Ben Rhodes, former national security advisor under President Obama, warned that accepting the administration's reasoning would give the executive branch near limitless power to justify lethal force anywhere, against anyone, on the speculation that a threat might someday materialize. This, he argues, is dangerous territory and undermines both U.S. credibility and international law. The controversy has also extended inside the Pentagon. A respected four-star admiral, Alvin Hoy, is reportedly being pushed into early retirement after raising legal concerns about these strikes. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Secretary of Defense allegedly told him, "You are either on the team or you are not," and criticized him for asking questions rather than immediately executing orders. This has raised alarms about a climate of intimidation within the Defense Department, where leaders may feel pressured to avoid expressing valid legal or ethical objections. At the same time, the Secretary of Defense has posted aggressive and unprofessional content online, including graphic imagery symbolizing destruction of enemy boats, and has publicly encouraged violent rhetoric from political allies. Critics argue this signals a disregard for seriousness, restraint, and the dignity expected of a senior military leader. The situation is further complicated by the administration's inconsistent approach to narcotics. While claiming to fight narco-terrorism, the administration is not addressing the fentanyl crisis, the most serious drug epidemic facing the United States today. Fentanyl primarily originates in Mexico after chemical production in China, not Venezuela. Most fentanyl deaths occur in states like West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. Yet the administration has focused resources on Venezuela, a country more relevant for oil than for synthetic drug production. This inconsistency feeds suspicions that the operations in the Caribbean are politically motivated rather than guided by genuine counter-narcotics strategy. Analysts argue that the administration is using anti-drug rhetoric to justify broader geopolitical ambitions. Continuing from the first segment, it is important to examine the role of military leadership and congressional oversight in these operations, as well as the implications for U.S. foreign policy and legal norms. The commander responsible for many of these Caribbean operations is Navy Admiral Frank M. Bradley. In recent closed-door sessions with members of the House and Senate, Admiral Bradley confirmed that he personally authorized the September 2 mission that targeted a Venezuelan boat suspected of narcotics trafficking. He also defended the follow-up strikes that eliminated survivors from the initial attack. Admiral Bradley justified these decisions by asserting that the two men who survived the initial strike still represented a continuing threat. He claimed that the individuals were getting back into the fight, despite video evidence showing them incapacitated on a capsized and burning vessel. These statements have been met with skepticism and criticism from lawmakers and legal experts. Democratic Congressman Adam Smith, ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, described the video he saw as depicting two men sitting without shirts on a small, partially submerged portion of the wrecked boat, a space barely large enough to hold 4 people. Smith questioned the assessment that these individuals were capable of continuing hostilities, calling the decision to strike them again highly questionable. Similarly, Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut, who also viewed the full footage, expressed deep concern about the ethical and legal implications of the strikes. He emphasized that these individuals were clearly in distress and lacked any visible means of survival or ability to pose a threat. Himes pointed out that the laws of armed conflict and Pentagon regulations are designed to protect people in such vulnerable situations. The technical legal standard is clear. Once an individual no longer has the capacity to engage in hostilities, they must be treated as hors de combat and cannot be targeted. The argument that these men might have communicated with others or resumed fighting is not supported by evidence. There were no radios, weapons, or other signs of operational capability on the wreckage. This raises serious questions about whether the strikes violated international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, and established military protocols. The implications are profound because the United States has historically sought to uphold these norms as a matter of national honor and strategic prudence. The administration's approach also raises concerns about transparency and accountability. The full video of the operations was initially withheld from Congress and the public. Only after pressure from lawmakers was the footage shared with a select group of congressional members behind closed doors. This secrecy has fueled mistrust and suspicion regarding the administration's narrative. Moreover, the White House press secretary's statements have intensified concerns. By framing the narco groups in Venezuela as foreign terrorist organizations, the administration claims this designation grants the president inherent authority as commander-in-chief to use military force without congressional approval. This represents a significant shift from traditional law enforcement to wartime action, raising constitutional questions. Senator Tom Cotton, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee and a vocal defender of the administration's policy, has argued that the president's authority under the Constitution allows such actions to protect the United States against foreign terrorist threats. Cotton referenced previous authorized uses of military force against terrorist groups to justify these strikes. However, critics reject this rationale, noting that Congress never passed a specific authorization for these military actions against Venezuela or the narco groups operating there. The absence of congressional authorization violates the War Powers Act, which requires the president to seek approval for military engagements lasting beyond 60 days. Legal experts, including Judge Advocate Generals, JAGs, within the military, have raised alarms about this interpretation. They warn that treating narcotics traffickers as terrorists to justify lethal force without due process is a dangerous and unprecedented expansion of executive power. It blurs the line between law enforcement and military action, potentially eroding civil liberties and international norms. Ben Rhodes, former national security advisor under President Obama, has cautioned that this kind of expansive authority risks opening the door to military actions anywhere in the world based on speculative threats. He emphasizes the importance of the laws of war, which protect wounded and incapacitated individuals and require restraint even in hostile environments. The current environment within the Pentagon appears tense and fraught with internal disagreements. The reported forced early retirement of Admiral Alvin Hoy, who raised questions about the legality of the strikes, suggests a lack of tolerance for dissenting opinions. According to reports, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth demanded unquestioning compliance, telling Hoy, "You are either on the team or you are not," pressuring military leaders to follow orders without scrutiny. This climate risks undermining the professionalism and integrity of the U.S. military command structure. Experienced officers may feel compelled to conceal concerns to protect their careers, limiting candid advice that is crucial for sound decision-making. Furthermore, Secretary Hegseth's public conduct has drawn criticism for being unprofessional and inflammatory. His online posts, including violent imagery and encouragement of aggressive rhetoric, contribute to a perception of recklessness and a lack of respect for the gravity of military operations. Such behavior from the civilian head of the Department of Defense is unusual and concerning. It raises questions about the seriousness with which military authority and the lives of service members are being treated at the highest levels. Meanwhile, questions remain about the actual focus of the administration's drug enforcement strategy. The fentanyl crisis, which is the leading cause of drug overdose deaths in the United States, predominantly originates from synthetic opioid production in China and Mexico, not Venezuela. The greatest impacts have been in Midwestern and Appalachian states. Despite this, the administration's military efforts have concentrated on Venezuelan transit routes for cocaine, a drug that, while harmful, is not the primary driver of current overdose deaths. This mismatch between stated priorities and actual drug threat profiles suggests that the counter-narcotics rationale may be a cover for other geopolitical ambitions, particularly related to controlling Venezuela's oil resources. In summary, the unfolding situation in the Caribbean and Venezuelan waters highlights a troubling convergence of constitutional overreach, questionable military conduct, and potentially self-serving geopolitical objectives. It underscores the urgent need for congressional oversight and public scrutiny to ensure that U.S. military power is exercised responsibly, transparently, and within the bounds of law. To fully understand the implications of these military operations, it is essential to place them within the broader context of U.S. foreign policy toward Venezuela and Latin America. The current administration's aggressive stance reflects long-standing tensions but also represents a significant escalation in both rhetoric and military posture. The official narrative has framed the operations as part of a campaign against narco-terrorism, targeting drug trafficking organizations that allegedly operate in conjunction with the Maduro regime. However, numerous analysts and former military officials argue that this framing obscures the true goal: regime change aimed at opening Venezuela's vast oil reserves to American and allied multinational corporations. This strategy is consistent with a historical pattern in U.S.-Latin American relations, where economic and geopolitical interests often drive interventions disguised as efforts to promote democracy or combat crime. The Venezuelan case is no exception, as the nation holds one of the world's largest proven oil reserves, a prize coveted by global energy companies. Despite this, the approach taken raises several alarming questions. The deployment of an extensive military force into the Caribbean, capable of offensive operations, suggests plans beyond simple interdiction of drug shipments. It hints at readiness for a broader military campaign, potentially including invasion or sustained conflict. This raises constitutional concerns. The War Powers Act requires the president to seek congressional approval for any military action lasting more than 60 days or involving combat beyond a limited scope. Yet, President Trump has not sought such authorization for the Caribbean operations. This pattern of circumventing Congress is troubling, as it undermines the constitutional balance of powers and reduces the legislative branch's ability to provide oversight. Without congressional approval, the executive branch effectively conducts foreign military engagements with minimal accountability. Such unilateral actions also have diplomatic ramifications. Venezuela remains a sovereign nation, recognized by the United Nations and most countries worldwide. Military operations within or near its territorial waters without explicit consent risk escalating tensions and provoking international condemnation. Moreover, the legality of repeated lethal strikes against vulnerable individuals, especially those rendered hors de combat, is highly questionable. International humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, protects shipwrecked and incapacitated persons from attack. When survivors of the initial strike were targeted again while clearly incapacitated and unable to fight, the action violated these protections. This sets a dangerous precedent and risks damaging the reputation of the U.S. military as a force that abides by the laws of war. The controversy is compounded by the administration's inconsistent rhetoric and actions. On the one hand, officials claim to be combating drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. On the other hand, actions such as the pardon of former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, convicted of drug trafficking, undermine that claim. This inconsistency fuels the argument that the drug war is a pretext rather than the real objective. Critics contend that the administration's priority is securing access to Venezuela's oil and reshaping the political landscape in a manner favorable to U.S. business interests. The role of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in these operations has been especially controversial. Reports indicate that Hegseth has shown a dismissive attitude toward legal concerns raised by senior military officers, insisting on unquestioned obedience and rapid execution of orders. His alleged statement to Admiral Alvin Hoy, "You are either on the team or you are not," reflects an environment intolerant of dissent. Such an atmosphere may discourage officers from voicing legitimate concerns about the legality and morality of military operations. Furthermore, Hegseth's public behavior, including inflammatory online posts and encouragement of violent rhetoric, raises questions about his suitability to oversee sensitive military missions. His approach appears at odds with the level of professionalism expected from the head of the Department of Defense. Within Congress, reactions have varied along partisan lines but include notable voices of concern. Democratic members have highlighted the ethical issues involved and questioned the administration's failure to adhere to legal processes. Some Republicans, while supportive of strong national defense, have also expressed unease about the lack of transparency and congressional oversight. The secrecy surrounding the release of video footage of the strikes has further eroded trust. Lawmakers were initially shown edited versions, with the full, uncut footage provided only after persistent demands. This has heightened suspicions that the administration may be attempting to conceal potentially damaging evidence. Legal scholars warn that treating narcotics traffickers as foreign terrorist organizations to justify military strikes without congressional authorization stretches the law beyond its intended scope. The use of military force against such groups risks conflating criminal justice with armed conflict, undermining established legal frameworks. Additionally, these actions could provoke retaliatory measures, escalating violence in the region. The Venezuelan government and its allies might respond with countermeasures that destabilize an already volatile geopolitical environment. From a humanitarian perspective, the repeated targeting of incapacitated individuals raises profound moral concerns. Military ethics emphasize the protection of non-combatants and those hors de combat, reflecting both legal obligations and moral imperatives. Violating these principles damages the credibility of U.S. military operations and can fuel anti-American sentiment, potentially increasing support for regimes the U.S. seeks to displace. Such outcomes may be counterproductive to long-term strategic goals. Meanwhile, the fentanyl crisis, which is devastating communities across the United States, remains inadequately addressed. Fentanyl primarily flows through Mexico, not Venezuela, yet the administration's military focus remains elsewhere. This misalignment suggests priorities may be politically motivated rather than driven by public health concerns. To address these challenges, many experts call for a renewed commitment to constitutional principles, including congressional oversight of military actions. The War Powers Act was designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral, unchecked military engagement. Restoring the balance of powers is essential to maintaining democratic accountability and preventing abuses of executive authority. It also ensures that decisions to use military force are made transparently and responsibly. Public awareness and media scrutiny play crucial roles in this process. Independent journalism and open debates can pressure government officials to adhere to the rule of law and ethical standards. In conclusion, The unfolding situation in the Caribbean exposes significant issues surrounding executive overreach, military ethics, and U.S. foreign policy objectives. The aggressive posture toward Venezuela raises questions about legality, morality, and the true goals behind military operations. As the debate over U.S. military operations in the Caribbean intensifies, it is vital to consider the human and institutional costs of such actions. The decisions made in Washington and military command centers have direct consequences for service members, affected populations, and the integrity of American democratic institutions. First and foremost, the lives of U.S. service members are at stake. Deploying an expansive force, including bomber aircraft, submarines, carrier strike groups, Marines, and special operations troops, into a volatile region poses inherent risks. Each military engagement, especially in contested waters near a sovereign nation, carries the potential for escalation, casualties, and unforeseen consequences. Critics have argued that the administration's approach reflects a disregard for the well-being of these service members. Former General Barry McCaffrey has expressed frustration, emphasizing that the president, who has never served in the military, seems to treat troops as expendable pawns in a broader geopolitical game. This perceived lack of respect undermines morale and raises questions about the ethical responsibilities of civilian leadership toward the armed forces. Furthermore, the circumstances surrounding the repeated strikes on incapacitated individuals aboard the Venezuelan boat highlight troubling issues of operational judgment and military ethics. Law enforcement and military professionals are bound by rules that protect those who are horsed to combat, out of the fight due to injury or incapacitation. Striking vulnerable individuals who clearly cannot threaten U.S. forces contravenes these rules and raises the specter of extrajudicial killings. Such actions not only violate domestic and international law but also damage the moral authority of the United States on the global stage. The political leadership's attitude toward dissent within the military is another area of concern. Reports that Admiral Alvin Hoy was forced into early retirement after questioning the legality of the boat strikes demonstrate a disturbing intolerance for oversight and accountability. The alleged statement by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, "You are either on the team or you are not," exemplifies a command climate that prioritizes obedience over ethical and legal considerations. This environment risks fostering a culture where officers feel compelled to suppress legitimate concerns in order to protect their careers. The erosion of open dialogue and critical oversight within the military hierarchy weakens the institution and may lead to further violations of law and ethics. Additionally, Secretary Hegseth's public conduct has been widely criticized. His social media posts featuring violent imagery and his engagement with aggressive political rhetoric blur the lines between professional military leadership and partisan politics. This behavior can undermine the public's trust in the Department of Defense and its leadership. Turning to the broader policy implications, the focus on Venezuela's drug trafficking routes, primarily cocaine transit, diverts attention from the more pressing fentanyl crisis, which has devastated communities across the United States. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid far more lethal and addictive than cocaine, largely originates from Mexico and China. Despite its lethality, fentanyl is not produced in Venezuela and does not transit primarily through the Caribbean. Yet, the administration has devoted substantial military resources to operations targeting Venezuelan vessels, while the fentanyl crisis remains insufficiently addressed at its main sources. This disconnect suggests that the administration's counter-narcotics efforts are motivated more by political and economic interests than by public health concerns. The desire to control Venezuela's oil reserves appears to be driving military and diplomatic efforts more than the goal of combating the opioid epidemic. Internationally, such military actions have implications for U.S. relationships in Latin America and beyond. Sovereignty violations risk alienating regional partners and contribute to perceptions of American imperialism. This can fuel anti-U.S. sentiment and destabilize regional security. In the United States, congressional oversight is critical to ensuring that military actions align with constitutional mandates and democratic accountability. The War Powers Act exists precisely to prevent unilateral military engagements without legislative approval. However, the administration's apparent circumvention of these requirements challenges the very foundations of American governance. Without effective checks and balances, the risk of executive overreach and unchecked military power increases. Lawmakers from both parties have expressed concern over the lack of transparency, the secrecy surrounding the operations, and the moral and legal questions they raise. There is growing demand for clearer guidelines, enhanced congressional involvement, and a comprehensive review of U.S. military actions in the region. In addition to legal and political concerns, these military operations have a profound human impact. Venezuelan civilians and communities may suffer as a result of heightened tensions and conflict escalation. The use of overwhelming military force in such a sensitive region can exacerbate humanitarian crises, displacement, and economic instability. It is imperative for U.S. policy to balance security objectives with respect for human rights and international law. Failure to do so undermines America's standing and hampers efforts to build sustainable peace and cooperation in the region. Finally, public engagement and independent media scrutiny are essential components in holding government accountable. Citizens must remain informed and critically evaluate government narratives. Support for independent journalism helps ensure that facts emerge and abuses are exposed. The challenges posed by the current Caribbean military operations demand thoughtful reflection, robust debate, and principled leadership. Only through adherence to legal norms, respect for human dignity, and transparent governance can the United States navigate these complex issues responsibly. As we conclude this detailed examination of the U.S. military operations in the Caribbean, it is important to reflect on the broader implications for American democracy, military ethics, and foreign policy. The use of military force abroad carries immense responsibility. It demands adherence to constitutional procedures, respect for international law, and a commitment to ethical standards. When these principles are disregarded or manipulated for political or economic gain, the consequences can be far-reaching and damaging. The recent strikes against suspected drug traffickers near Venezuela, particularly the lethal follow-up attacks on incapacitated survivors, raise profound legal and moral questions. These actions appear to violate both U.S. laws and the international laws of armed conflict, undermining the credibility of the United States as a nation that respects human rights and the rule of law. Moreover, the administration's decision to bypass Congress and unilaterally deploy significant military assets contradicts the constitutional framework designed to balance powers between the executive and legislative branches. The War Powers Act was enacted precisely to prevent such unchecked military engagements and to ensure democratic accountability. The chilling rhetoric and conduct of key figures, such as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, exacerbate these concerns. Leadership marked by intolerance toward dissent, inflammatory public statements, and reckless behavior jeopardizes not only military discipline but also public trust in government institutions. Meanwhile, the selective focus on Venezuela's role in drug trafficking distracts from the urgent and deadly fentanyl crisis impacting the United States. The opioid epidemic demands comprehensive strategies grounded in science, law enforcement, and public health, none of which appear prioritized in this military campaign. Internationally, the heavy-handed military approach risks escalating tensions with Venezuela and destabilizing the wider region. Respect for sovereignty, diplomacy, and adherence to international norms remain essential pillars for maintaining peace and cooperation in Latin America. For the American public and their representatives, this moment calls for vigilance, critical inquiry, and demand for transparency. Congress must assert its constitutional role, scrutinizing military actions and ensuring that they are lawful, justified, and serve the nation's genuine interests. Citizens can support this process by staying informed, supporting independent media, and engaging in constructive dialogue about the country's direction. Democracy depends on an informed and active populace holding leaders accountable. In closing, the challenges posed by the current U.S. military operations in the Caribbean highlight the need for a principled approach to foreign policy, one grounded in legality, morality, and respect for human life. Only by recommitting to these ideals can the United States maintain its leadership role responsibly and uphold the values that define it as a nation. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and together we can work toward a more just and transparent future.